todas y todos a esta sesión muy especial, esta clase magistral que nos congrega aquí y que hace parte del homenaje que le celebramos esta 12ª edición al gran cinefotógrafo Ed Lachman, que nos acompaña aquí para impartir esta clase magistral. Bueno, yo soy Maximiliano Cruz, director artístico de Ficunam. Quisiera nada más hacer un agradecimiento muy especial a la cátedra Ingmar Bergman por la colaboración para esta sesión, una colaboración que además viene de varias ediciones atrás de Ficunam y que es realmente de celebrar. También quisiera agradecer, pues, por supuesto, a la Filmoteca, a toda la coordinación de difusión cultural, a la Universidad Centro y a CM Idiomas, que nos está proveyendo toda la asistencia para traducción y técnica en general. Esta clase magistral, además, va a estar moderada por la gran fotógrafa María Secco. A mí en lo personal me da muchísima alegría, María, gracias por aceptar que estés aquí. María, seguramente muchas de ustedes la conocen, la ubican por películas pues como que van, no sé, desde Te prometo anarquía, El comediante más recientemente. Tiene una filmografía bastante amplia y pues quisiera pedirles un doble aplauso para María Secco y para Edward Lachman, por favor. Bueno, ya para cerrar, pues nada más quisiera agradecerte, Ed, muchísimas gracias por tu presencia. Sé que ha sido todo un proceso, también que estés aquí con nosotros acompañándonos. Muchísimas gracias, es un honor y un placer para Ficunam y para toda la universidad que estés aquí con nosotros. En este homenaje, que además quisiera recordar, es la primera vez que en el marco de Ficunam se entrega la medalla Filmoteca. En este caso a un técnico, es la primera vez que homenajeamos a alguien que no pertenece al mundo de la dirección estrictamente, ni a un director o directora. Esto con el ánimo también de celebrar el carácter colectivo del quehacer cinematográfico. Y pues qué mejor que pues sea con uno de los íconos del cine independiente, además de lo fílmico. Ed Lachman es un militante de lo fílmico, muy apegado al 16 milímetros, y esto se articula muy bien con cierto concepto transversal que atraviesa la 12ª edición de Ficunam. Así que pues no me resta más que darles las gracias a todas y a todos ustedes por venir acá, y pues podemos dar inicio a esta clase magistral de Edward Lachman, moderada por María Secco. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias por haberme invitado a estar aquí. Es un honor y yo personalmente estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con Ed, y pienso que es una celebración que en México, y que estamos de fiesta al recibirlo. Un artista, uno de los más grandes cinefotógrafos que ha contribuido al cine y a su lenguaje a lo largo de muchos años, y una colaboración con directores en diferentes geografías. Trabajado en películas independientes alrededor del mundo y ha creado vínculos y lazos a través de los años con estos directores, y ya sea por sus temas, su método, sus personajes, su estilo, logra una colaboración única en su trabajo en sus proyectos con estos directores o directoras. Como menciona Brody en su artículo, el trabajo del cinefotógrafo frente a la cámara puede influenciar el ánimo del espectador subliminalmente, y detrás de la cámara va a interpretar no lo que le pide el director, sino los deseos más profundos que tiene el director a la hora de querer contar esa historia y cómo conectarse con su público. Es a través de esa visión que esa mirada del cinefotógrafo que va a hacer que lo que está queriendo transmitir el director se llegue a contar de una manera interna, de una manera con un vínculo más fuerte con el espectador de esa película. La búsqueda de Ed se centra, según lo que menciona, en buscar imágenes que narren algo que el interior de esos personajes, ¿no? Que darán una vida interna a esas películas. Bueno, solo celebrar que Ed está aquí con nosotros y ahora le dejo la palabra a Ed, que nos va a presentar algo que trajo para nosotros.
Thank you for coming out on a Sunday, and it's certainly an honor to be here and invited to this festival. You have so many wonderful cinematographers yourself that to invite me is a real honor. So the first thing I thought about was I made kind of a reel. I hope it's not too long, about 15 minutes. But it's over like 40 years of my work. It's not maybe the last 2 or 3 films I've done, but I thought it would give a context to what images are and how you use images and the different forms that, because I've always felt the documentary form is as important as the narrative form, and in a way, I've always thought that all films are documents in a way. No performance is ever the same. The light isn't exactly the same where the actor goes, where the camera movement moves. So, and it's also that you're dealing with real time and space. So I'm always interested in the moment that things are happening in. So I'm always trying to be more responsive, even in a narrative form, to the moment. So we'll look at this reel, and then maybe that will open up some questions. And I know you have some questions, and then I can talk a little more about what images are for me and how we use images in cinema and what makes cinema unique in its storytelling because of images. So I guess my point, or what I want to discuss, is what makes film in its storytelling different than a play or a book or an opera or even a photograph or a painting. It's that you are expressing something in time and space and the duration of it, and there's nothing like that, and that's what makes film unique in its storytelling. So for me, the language of cinema is images, it's not words. Now, not every director is visual, and different directors are more interested in the acting or the word, but obviously I'm more interested in directors that portray the story through the images, because for me the images are the subtext. They're like music. They have a nonverbal form of communicating, and I always use this as kind of an analogy of when in writing in a narrative, you can show. You can enter the interior world of the character in 1 or 2 sentences and say how a character thinks or feels, but it's much more difficult to show place, where you are. You spend more sentences or words to explain the setting where you are, where in film it's just the opposite. You can show place, but it's much harder to show what the interior world of the characters are. So for me, that's what I'm always working at with a director, is finding the interior world of the character and trying to present that, represent that in a visual way to engage the audience in the emotions of the character.
Yes, that's amazing. Y como decía antes, es un
Yes,
poco lo
that's
que él
amazing.
menciona,
And
que es su búsqueda. Y yo te quería
it's,
preguntar,
as I was saying, that's your search. And I wanted to ask you, Ed,
¿cómo
how
en cada proyecto,
in
o si
each of
tienes
your projects,
algún proyecto en mente que nos
or
puedes comentar, cómo
if you have any project
te
in mind
planteas
now that you can
reto,
talk
este
about,
proceso
but in
creativo
general,
de
how
buscar
do
las
you
imágenes
get,
presentar ese
how do
mundo
you find
interior,
the images
ya sea en
to
documental
show
o
that
ficción?
inner world of the characters that you
imaginaba
were
si
mentioning,
esta búsqueda
either in
es desde que
documentary
estás
or
leyendo el
fiction?
guión,
So how does
o
this
puede
come
ser,
about? Does it begin when you begin
en la
reading
preparación,
the script?
si es en
Or
trabajo de
does
mesa,
it
o
begin
si
when you
llega,
begin doing the
a pasar también
pre-production, in the
en
table work
el
and that?
momento
Or
en el
does it
rodaje, cuando ya está
happen
todo
during the
listo, si
shooting
también ahí
itself,
siguen
when
apareciendo
everything is
estas
ready?
ideas,
I mean,
concepto
all of
para
these ideas, all
contar el
of
mundo
these
interior
concepts to talk,
de
to
los
narrate
personajes.
the inner world of the characters, when does it happen? Or does it happen all through those stages?
Yeah, I would say it happens through all those stages, but different directors want to approach the imagery in different ways. And someone, let's say, like that I've worked with a number of times, Todd Haynes, he does a lookbook. And in this lookbook, he's referencing maybe the history, maybe the art of the time, the demographics, we look for those clues, of what the script is about, and then who these characters are in that story. So there's not one way, but certainly the pre-production is the most important part for me, and that's, I don't think like with Todd, we reference other movies, but he'll certainly reference, because we've worked a lot in different times, like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. We've worked in all those different time periods. But we look at the, how can I say, the tools that they used to make those films. And a lot of times those tools give us clues to the way the images are presented. I could give you an example, let's say like Wonderstruck. It's a film that takes place in two time periods, in the 20s and in the black and white era, and in the 70s, which is more kind of the neo-realistic New York, French Connection, Midnight Cowboy world, where it was more on location photography. And Todd came to me and said, how do they do those shots in the streets? Because there were long tracking shots in the streets. And the cinematographer, Owen Rosman, is still alive, and barely. And I called him up, and I know him, and I said, and I kind of knew how he did those shots. He did it on a Western dolly. They didn't have track, where you put the dolly on, but it was like rubber wheels on a wooden platform, and they pulled it. And now they use that piece of equipment just to carry equipment around, not to put the camera on it. So when I said to the grips are the people that move the camera, Todd wants to use a Western dolly to do these long tracking shots in the street, because you can't lay track in the street in New York because the cars are going to run over it, So you could do it with maybe a crane arm, which I did in the opening of Carol. That long movement was done with a crane arm on a camera car, which they placed on the camera car and moved it. And they said, what, are you crazy? I mean, we did that 40 years ago. Why are we going to go backwards? I said, well, that's the way Todd wants to do it. And of course, by doing it that way, it created a feeling in the streets that we never could have created if we hadn't used that method. And same in Carol, that shot in Carol, it was freezing cold. I thought, why can't we do that on a stage? I could have done moving lights and the rain and everything. But no, we had to do it on location. But I'm sure I never would have gotten the look that way because of the ambient light in the streets created those textures. So that's one thing that I think Todd is very aware or brilliant about, is that it's the authenticity to the image. You know, I don't use the word truth anymore, but I think that's what an audience responds to, is the believability in what the image is. And so that's what I'm also trying to explore with the director. But like I say, you know, the script is the clues that you use to find the visual language. And for me, images are also a metaphor for the storytelling. So you're looking for the visual metaphors for what that story is expressing about the subject and about the characters. And the way you move the camera, or if it's static, all say something about the psychology of what you're looking at. And you know, it's always too about subjectivity, about whose point of view are you telling the story through. Writers understand this, and I think it's important. You know, Hollywood has a tendency, and I shouldn't just say Hollywood, a certain kind of filmmaking, where you can shoot every angle and then create the story in the editing room. Well, in Europe, you don't have that luxury, but also you take a point of view of what the camera is going to see, and for me, that's a stronger way to tell the story than thinking you have every option to shoot it and then figure it out later. I always think it gets diluted what the point of view is of how you're telling the story. So those are, you know, where you place the camera says something about how you are viewing it. You know, the camera really is your vision, but it's your vision through our vision.
If you have a way how you like to approach the project, a favorite way, or if you have an experience that you like very much, how you start to think about a movie, how you do all the pre-production process. If you are going to do a future movie, what is your favorite things that you would ask to prepare it,
o que sean las cosas que te gustaría más pedir
para
poder preparar todo y para tener tiempo para cómo trabajar la película,
My
digamos?
favorite time is the pre-production, because when you're shooting, you don't really have time to think about it. You're just trying to make your day, you know, which you know. So in pre-production, you have a chance to play. You know, you obviously you're searching for the locations with the crew, with the director, with the art director, but you know, everything is possible when you're in pre-production. And you know, the way you work with light, the way you work with color. I know that's a question you want to ask me about color, how I use color, because my background was studio art, painting, and so I've always thought color is not just a decorative element, but it's a psychological element. You know, it goes back to Goethe in 1810, and then Joseph Albers in the 60s that wrote books about understanding how color affects the viewer psychologically. And you know, it's why are hospitals mostly green or blue? Because people perceive that color as a restful color. Or why restaurants usually use warm colors. They use warm colors because they've decided or discovered that it creates appetite. You know, so that's a simplistic way of thinking about it, but I always have used colors, and we talked about it a little. I use advancing and receding colors, which I mean, you know, primary colors go ahead. You know, they're in your face more. And secondary colors are behind those. They won't be seen as readily as the primary colors. So in a film, let's say like the Douglas Sirk film, Far From Heaven, there's always a warm and cool color in the set, and it's advancing and receding, almost the way black and white photography used gray. You know, they would use different shades of gray and light and dark to create depth to the image. Well, you can also do that with color. So I'm always very conscious about how I use color, how I either use it in the set or in the wardrobe or in the color temperature. The color temperature is if I'm using tungsten lights, yellow lights, or fluorescent lights, or sodium vapor lights, and I like to mix those lights to give a texture, a depth to the image. And even in naturalistic films, I like to play with that. I don't know, did I answer the question?
Bueno, yo quería preguntarte antes, ¿en qué momento sentiste, tú venías de un estudio de pintura y de arte, ¿en qué momento te encontraste con la cinefotografía y sentiste que ese era un medio que tú encontrabas cómodo para expresarte y que te acompañó una vida? Sí. ¿Qué fue ese sentir con la cinefotografía donde encontraste ese espacio?
Well, I was in art school, and I was taking courses in studio art, which is the practical part of it, and then also in art history. And I realized it took years to develop your own technique. And I took this so-called gut course, or appreciation course in cinema at Harvard. And it was a film course also about Italian neorealism by Gideon Bachman. And I saw this film, Umberto D, by the Secco. And I was so taken by the film, it was almost like a silent film. It was about an old age pensioner, and he was very poor, and he loses his dog, and anyway. And I was so taken to the idea that you could tell a story almost purely with images. And I realized I was always interested in the found image. I was interested in the Dadaist, and I was interested in German Expressionism. So I thought, wow, that you could pick up a camera, and also the isolation of painting was that you were alone. And I always loved the communal aspect of a work. You know, I can remember when I was a kid, and they were building houses around where I lived, and I loved hanging out with these, you know, workers, watching them build the house. So the aspect of the communal idea of creating something better than just what you can do yourself, and the idea that you could pick up a camera and tell a story was what motivated me. And then what happened was I made little portraits of people and things in Super 8, and people saw them and they said, oh, would you shoot for me? And so I ended up being a cinematographer. I'd never anticipated being a cinematographer. I always thought, oh, I'll be a filmmaker. So I've always made my own little films, but I kind of kept that private, because once I became a cinematographer, I kind of lost the fun. It is fun, but you know, I was doing it for somebody else, and you know, I was making a living at it. And, you know, I always like to keep something private for myself. Even like still photography, I keep private, even though I've done some shows. So that's how I ended up being a cinematographer.
Okay. es notorio en el trabajo y
very clear in your work
que hay una parte de director. Tú,
like you are a director
escuchándote ahora mencionarlo,
because now that you mentioned
¿tú
it
crees
about this private work and that,
que tu
you think
colaboración
that your
es tan importante
collaboration
y tan
in this
fuerte con los
teamwork,
directores es
with the
también
directors,
ese
because
apoyo
it's a very close
para
relationship
narrar,
that you
o
establish
sea,
with directors,
para contar
and
la
you
historia?
also offer support to
Hay
tell the story
un ojo también de
in
director.
terms of the narration. Do you think you have the eye of a director as well, like the glance of a film director?
Well, I'll give you my experience between the two, because
Okay.
I've done both. And when I'm a cinematographer, I know the point of view. I know where I'm going. I know what to do. And when I direct, I always know there's another way to do it, that there's more than one option to do it. And so I'm more insecure of myself as a director than I ever am as a cinematographer. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, probably many directors that I haven't worked with, because when I go to an interview with a director, I usually bring a lot of visual references or books or ideas to let them know that I have ideas, even though if it's not their ideas, they see there's a point of view. And some directors are threatened by that. And I've had situations where I said to this one director, do you see the film naturalistically or expressionistically? And he looked at me and goes, what are you talking about? So I knew I wasn't going to get that job. But probably that was better to do it that way than not do that way. So I've been very lucky to work with very strong directors that appreciate that, you know, and they don't mind that kind of, ultimately it's the director's choice what he takes or doesn't take from everybody in the crew, but generally the best directors are ones that are open, even though they have a strong point of view, to see what you can contribute to their ideas.
Totally, yeah. Bueno, yo sé que
I know
tienes
that,
una mirada
I know
muy
that you have
atenta a
a
la
very
piel y
attentive
a los
glance
rostros
to the skin, to the human
a la hora
skin, and to the faces
de
when
hacer
you
tu
are
trabajo
doing
como
your
cinefotógrafo.
work as a cinematographer.
¿Qué nos podrías contar
What could you
sobre
tell
eso?
us about that? The skin and the faces and the way you...
Well, I don't know if I pay attention any more than any other aspect of it, but obviously that's what you're photographing mostly. I mean, I didn't say this, Sven Nykvist said this, you know, the face is your landscape. So, you know, I could use that as a statement, but no, I mean, even, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about exposure. I have this system in the digital world that I've been pushing for the last 5 years. Well, I've done it since I was in film school. It's called the zone system. It really came out of Ansel Adams, a black and white landscape photographer that figured out how you could predetermine the exposure of your negative and have a look, you know, where your highlights would hold the detail and where your shadows would hold the detail. And when the digital world came in, it was kind of, how do I understand exposure the way I understood exposure in the photochemical world, in the film world? You know, because in the film world, you know, you have a light meter, you have the stops on your lens and the processing in the lab, and those are factors determine how your negative is going to look to create a look, you know. So it was kind of a mystery to me, like, how do I figure this out in the digital world? Because you have somebody called a DIT, a digital intermediate, whatever the T stands for. But then I was relying on somebody to do what I do. You know, it's a very insecure thing for me to, like, rely on somebody else to tell me my exposure looks good, or whatever that means, you know. So I came up with an idea of creating, it's all based on 18% gray. That's what our light meters were set up for, that's what our lenses were set up for. But the digital world, not to cause aspersions to the digital world, but the people that designed and understood that world didn't think about the analog world. They didn't think about how cinematographers use exposure to create images. And they have something called IRE, which is a pretty funny thing because IRE stands for International Radio Engineers, from 1895, before we even had sound. So I was going, wow, how can that be? We're basing our exposure on radio signals. So I did a funny video about that because to promote this idea. So lo and behold, your meters do not correspond to what the IRE is, and they have this thing called false color and with your waveform monitors. And I'm an old guy, so I didn't grow up with this, so I had to kind of figure out what all this stuff means. But I came up with my system and then went to all these camera manufacturers like Arri and Red and everybody and told them about this, and they go, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, Ed, but you know. But now it's finally come to fruition. You know, I've been at them forever, and finally what I did is appealed to cinematographers, and they all said, great, because now there'll be consistency between one camera manufacturer and another camera manufacturer, because everybody will know what 18% gray is, and you can take a picture of an image, and then you will see the gradations of the exposure from 18% gray, and you'll know what one stop over looks like or what two stops under looks like. And then you can recreate that when you come back. If you have to recreate a scene to reshoot it, you'll know what to do. And it will also help young cinematographers and even experienced cinematographers understand, oh, the window is red today, so I don't have any detail. But if I make it orange, I will have detail. So it's a way of understanding how to control your negative. So I hope I didn't get too technical for the non-cinematographers.
No, thank you very much.
But you wanted to know about
yes,
that. So
yes.
that's
And how does it work? Where do you see that?
where what?
Where do you see the
Oh,
exposure?
so
Yeah.
it will be in the camera, and you'll
Okay.
see it in the viewfinder.
Oh, great.
You'll
You
hit
press
a
a button,
and it's an exposure mapping, and so whatever image you want to look at, you can hit a button, and then you'll see the color come up, and you'll know those colors represent the exposure and how that will look.
Oh, that's great. I hope. I don't know if you would like to talk something about reflections. I know you are.
You want to speak Spanish?
Ah, yes. Quería preguntarte, sé que es algo que te gusta mucho, que son los reflejos, y bueno, aquí veíamos una imagen espectacular de Carol con una cantidad de, no, era previa a Carol, con una cantidad de, unas puertas que se van abriendo y se van reflejando y luego aparece el personaje. ¿Son cosas que se encuentran en la locación o son planeadas? ¿Cómo es el trabajo con ese mundo de los reflejos?
All right, well, this started in Carol. And it was actually the production designer, Mark Freeberg, who told Todd and I, you should look at Saul Leiter. And Saul Leiter was a contemporary photographer of Robert Frank. He was a street photographer in New York. But he was very close to a lot of the abstract expressionist painters, and he wanted really to be a painter, but he in a weird way, and he always continued to be a painter, but he painted on his photographs. But his images, when you look at his images, aren't about the content of subject matter. The content of, well, it is subject matter. His subject matter were like the textures of the world that he was viewing, you know, reflections, weather in the image. And again, we were very lucky that we found a visual metaphor for Carol, because the women are obviously hiding their relationship to themselves and to the outside world. And so the visual metaphor of someone like Saul Leiter's work, which was about not something hidden, obfuscated. It was something that we as the viewer, when we see people are cut off in doorways, through glass, through weather, through steam, it was almost like their desire is inhibited by what you don't see. And so visually, we, the viewer, not being able to see the character fully is kind of psychologically what's happening to the character, not being able to see out what they want to be able to embrace in their life. So it started with that film, and then we used it in other films, that technique visually of blocking or it was, how can I say it? It was almost the repression of the image is kind of what inhibits you, the viewer, seeing something of what they're feeling. But there were other visual references too. We were referencing for Carol, we discovered that a lot of the street photographers were women at the time. Helen Bubley, Helen Levitt, Helen Levitt, Esther Bubley, and Ruth Orkin, and then later Vivian Meyer. And they were experimenting with early color film, slide film. And so that was another thing that I played with, was not having the colors, the full color spectrum of what we would see color today as representing. So I limited the color palette, and also then the decision to shoot Super 16 over 35 was again to somehow mimic the way film grain looked back then, you know. So, and also then another aspect that you go in with ideas and you don't really know if they're going to work or not, but the most important thing to do is to be consistent, because you can't change every weekend, whatever film you saw that looks cool, to try to do that, you know. Then it loses a point of view. So you just, that's the hardest part. If I said my job is to be consistent with what I'm doing and to have everybody on board to be consistent in their visual approach to the storytelling. So the grain also enhanced a feeling of something on the surface that wasn't, that was kind of, how can I say it, anthropomorphic. It was living, you know. And in fact, if we talk about the world between the digital world and the video world and the film world, that's another aspect of why I like film, because I don't think all stories have to be told digitally or film. They don't all have to be told film-wise, but film has a color depth that I find lacks digitally. It lacks these three layers, the RGB. They're microscopic, but it's like an etching when it's developed. And that gives you a color depth to the image, but also the way colors respond are differently in film than they are digitally. And then the other aspect of it is the digital world is on I call it a pixel fixated plane. It's one plane. Shadows and colors are all on one plane. Where in film, it's these layers, these color layers, RGB, red, green, blue, that give you depth to the image that you don't get digitally. So the image seems flatter to me. Now, they're working on a 3-layer digital chip, but they haven't come up with a good solution for that.
Okay. And, ¿cómo encuentras ¿Cómo te has encontrado, cómo te has sentido con el trabajo de corrección de color en digital? ¿Cómo ha sido tu experiencia en ese proceso? Y si trabajas muy parecido con correcciones primarias como se solía hacer en analógico, o cómo es tu manera de trabajar en la postproducción de las películas.
Well, actually, you can do things now in grading that you could never do on film, where you can isolate areas, you can matte areas out with exposure. So the color grading is actually a blessing in the digital world. So you can do things that you could never do in film. There's only one problem. And this is a real cinematographer talking. You now have the director sitting next to you every second. And it used to be that you would put your corrections in the negative, and then there would be a delay of the night of getting it developed, and then you come back and you look at it the next day with the director. So sometimes you could talk to the colorist and say, well, do it a little this way or don't do it that way. And then they would see it the next day and they wouldn't remember. Not always, but you know. But now digitally, and it's maybe not all directors, but the directors I've worked with, they want to be there every second. So I have no time to modify things to let them see what it could look like. Because a lot of times when you're in that moment and you say, oh, can't we do it that way? They're going to say, no, I don't want it that way, or let's leave it the way it is. So I find it a lot harder in my color correct to have the director there 24/7 if I don't have my time with a colorist. So I try to go in earlier or later.
Yes. Bueno, te quería preguntar cómo es impresionante el cuerpo de trabajo de tu carrera. ¿Cómo es tu manera de escoger los proyectos, de emocionarte con ellos? ¿Cómo te has encontrado con todos estos directores? Un poco que nos cuentes cómo ha sido a través de todos estos años buscar esos proyectos o encontrártelos sí. O si ha sido un poco sin pensar.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, look, when you start out, you're happy to get any work, all right? But early on, I kind of, Werner Herzog really gave me my break, right? But I met him on a personal level. I met him in Berlin. It was his first film, Signs of Life, and we became friends. And then a few years later, you know, he asked me to work with him on La Soufrière and then Stroszek and then a few other documentaries. And I would say, and I say this to young cinematographers, seek out the filmmakers or your associates, people that are you're at the same level. And if those people see something in you because you're not just trying to get a job, but they understand aesthetically you're creatively interested in what they do, those are the people that will help you. And so, like, why did I end up working with Ulrich Seidel? Well, I saw his work actually through Werner Herzog. He had seen it. Werner saw a film that I did with Larry Clark, Ken Park, and he said, oh, not bad, but that's kid stuff. You got to meet Ulrich Seidel. So I didn't know who Ulrich Seidel, but I happened to be going to Vienna to the Biennale that year, and I told the director I'd like to see Ulrich Seidel's, work. He said, well, how do you know? Why do you want to see his work? Because I don't think he was a big fan of Ulrich's work. And Ulrich and I became friends, and then he offered me to work with him on import-export. And I don't think he thought I would do it, but I would gladly do it because I just wanted to see how he worked, because he's so exceptional of how he tells narratives, where he has a concept for a story, he's researched it, and then he tries to find the actual characters that are those people, and the people that he can't find, he'll use actors, and then his script works off of what you've done the day before. So he'll shoot a scene, and he'll even say, thank you very much, and you go back and you reshoot the scene until something happens that he never anticipated. So he basically sets up the situation, but not with set dialogues. And then from there, he goes in the editing room and edits the scene and then decides where the story will go. So he takes 2 or 3 years to make a film. So nobody can make films this way. But he's his own producer. He makes it with a very small crew, maybe 4 or 5 people, and he's able to make the style of his filmmaking. I'm trying to think of, well, I'll give you an example. Oh, and then, I went into the Hollywood system in a way, and I got the, traditional agent, UTA, all this stuff. And then it kind of dawned on me that what happens in Hollywood many times is agents start controlling who gets what work. So if an agent has 10 of the best cinematographers in that moment, they can decide who gets what job. Well, they're going to give it to Roger Deakins or Chivo, who I love, because, they're the ones that can bring in the biggest money for them. So in a weird way, I got rid of my agent a few years ago, and I went back and I just seeked out the people again the way I started that I really respected. And there's somebody that I always respected his work. We were always friendly with each other when we saw each other, and it came to pass I'm going to be doing Pablo Larraín's next film in Chile. So it comes circle. So that's all I would say to young cinematographers is just seek out the people whose work you really respect, and those will be the people that will ultimately help you more than being in some system. I mean, you probably don't have to worry about that here because it's a smaller community, so you know everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good advice. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you also, what things, qué cosas te emocionan y te motivan hoy a nivel del arte, del cine, en qué cosas buscas tus referencias o tu motivación.
You know, it kind of dawns on you after time. You know, I mean, the photographer that got me interested also in images was Robert Frank, and I became a close friend of Robert's. But I think I saw a film here that I really liked. White Night?
Noche Blanca.
Yeah. I think I like reality-based stories, and then you can take them where you go. But I personally like the reality. So, or look, film is the illusion of reality, and it's how we manipulate that illusion. So, I mean, we're not saying you're seeing reality, you're seeing the interpretation of that reality. But there was a film, Lorna, Lorno, a Guatemalan director, Lorna.
¿Alguien sabe?
Anyway, I
Lorena.
saw that.
La
What?
Llorona. La
Yeah,
Llorona.
yeah. So that was a wonderful film. I didn't know about that filmmaker I saw a year ago. There's a film, I think my favorite film of last year was Red Rocket by Sean Baker. Another reality-based story, but takes it somewhere else. So I would say that.
Amigo.
Bueno,
Muchas gracias.
muchísimas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Muchísimas gracias, Ed.